How long does it take for a safe currency to become worthless? 3 years. That's what happened in Germany between 1921 and 1923. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks in late 1922 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. If you're thinking, that could never happen today, that's exactly what every German thought in 1921. They had one of the world's most respected currencies. They had engineers, scientists, a strong industrial base. And within 36 months, people were burning money in their stoves because it was cheaper than buying firewood. This video is about one idea. Hyperinflation doesn't start with wheelbarrows full of cash. It starts with a government that believes it can print its way out of a debt problem. And every government that's tried it, every single one, thought they were different, thought they had it under control, thought they could stop before it spiraled. They were all wrong. I'm the debt archivist. My job is to dig through old files to find patterns your news never explains. Today we're opening the file on the Weimar Republic hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923. Not because it's ancient history, because the same sequence is setting up right now in 2025. Same debt trap, same political incentives, same psychology. And if you understand what happened in Germany, you'll recognize the early warnings we're seeing today. When a world power lost its money. Let's go back to Germany in 1918. World War I had just ended. Germany had accumulated 156 billion marks in war debts. That's massive. But here's what matters. They weren't panicking yet. Germany still had industry, still had exports, still had one of the most educated workforces in Europe. The mark had lost some value during the war, sure, but nothing catastrophic. Prices had doubled. Annoying, but manageable. Think of it like the United States in 2021. Inflation ticking up, but everyone saying it's transitory, it'll pass. Then came the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The Allies imposed reparations on top of Germany's existing war debt. By May 1921, the total bill was set. 50 billion marks in reparations payable in cash and in kind, coal, timber, industrial goods. Now, Germany had two problems: massive war debt they'd accumulated themselves, and massive reparations they had to pay to foreign powers. The German government looked at this situation and made a decision that seems logical in the moment but ends in catastrophe every time. They decided to inflate their way out. Here's the psychology. You're a German politician in 1920. You've got voters demanding jobs, demanding services, demanding that life return to normal after 4 years of war. You've got foreign governments demanding payments. You've got no gold reserves left. Those were drained during the war. What do? You can't raise taxes enough. The economy is too weak. You can't cut spending. People would riot. So you do the one thing that feels like it solves every problem at once. You print money. In August 1921, the German central bank began buying hard currency with paper marks at any price. They claimed it was to pay reparations. In reality, it was to fund the government. And for a few months, it seemed to work. The exchange rate stabilized at about 320 marks per dollar for the first half of 1922. People started to relax. See? The government had it under control. They'd navigated the crisis. This is the moment right here where every inflation disaster becomes inevitable. Because once you start printing, the pressure to keep printing never stops. By mid-1922, confidence began to crack. Prices had risen by some 700%. People who'd been patient started getting nervous. And this is where human psychology takes over. When you think money will be worth less tomorrow, you spend it today. You buy anything real, furniture, food, property, anything that will hold value. This increases demand, which increases prices, which makes everyone panic more, which makes them spend faster. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. In January 1923, something happened that turned inflation into hyperinflation. France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr Valley, Germany's main industrial region, because Germany had missed reparations payments. This was Germany's industrial heart. Coal mines, steel mills, the source of everything Germany exported. The German government's response was to order passive resistance. Workers were told to do nothing that helped the occupiers. It amounted to a general strike. But there was a problem. Those striking workers still needed to eat, still had families to feed, and the government promised to support them. How do you support millions of striking workers when you have no tax revenue coming in from the industrial region you just told to stop working? You print money, massive amounts of money. The government paid striking workers by printing more and more banknotes, with Germany soon being swamped with paper money. By summer 1923, the printing presses were running 24 hours a day. They couldn't print fast enough. By November 1923, one US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. Let me give you a sense of what that meant in daily life. A cup of coffee might cost 5,000 marks when you ordered it. By the time you finished drinking, that same cup would cost 7,000 marks. Eggs cost half a mark in 1918, 3 marks in 1921, 500 marks in January 1923, 30 million marks in September, and 4 billion marks in October. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, at lunch and at closing, because if they waited until the end of the day, their morning wages would be worthless. People rushed from the pay window to stores, spending everything immediately. Shopkeepers couldn't replenish stock fast enough. Farmers refused to sell produce for worthless money. Food riots broke out. Pensioners starved. Townspeople marched into the countryside to loot farms. This is what currency death looks like. Not theory, reality. And it happened in one of the most advanced economies in the world in 3 years. 2 traps. Weimar versus Venezuela. Let's compare Germany 1921 to Venezuela 2014. Different eras, different politics, but watch how similar the pattern is. Both started with a debt problem and a government that thought it could manage inflation through money printing. Both believed they were special cases, that the normal rules didn't apply. Germany in 1921 had war debt and reparations. Venezuela in 2014 had falling oil prices and social spending commitments. In both cases, the government faced a choice: cut spending, raise taxes, or print money. And in both cases, printing money seemed like the path of least political resistance. Germany printed to fund war costs and keep voters happy during Reconstruction. Venezuela printed to maintain social programs and avoid unrest as oil revenue collapsed. Here's where it gets interesting. In Germany, resourceful companies began to buy material assets on credit in order to repay them later with devalued money. They understood what was coming. The smart money, businesses, wealthy individuals borrowed heavily and bought real assets, land, equipment, inventory. Then they repaid those loans with worthless paper. Meanwhile, anyone with savings, pensions, or fixed income got wiped out. In 1921, a family with 100,000 marks in savings would have been considered wealthy. Within 2 years, that amount wouldn't buy a cup of coffee. Venezuela followed the exact same pattern. Businesses with connections borrowed from state banks and bought imports, real estate, foreign currency. Workers and pensioners destroyed. By 2018, Venezuelan inflation topped 1,000,000% annually. The pattern was identical to Weimar just 80 years later. But here's the key difference that matters for 2025. Germany stabilized by introducing a new currency in late 1923, the Rentenmark, backed by mortgage bonds. They stopped printing, they imposed discipline, it worked. Venezuela, still printing, still inflating, still trapped. Why? Because Germany in 1923 had credibility left with foreign lenders, had industrial capacity, had a pathway to reform. Venezuela doesn't. And this is the trap door. Once you lose global credibility, once your currency becomes a joke, it's almost impossible to come back. Now think about the United States in 2025. The deficit is $1.8 trillion. That's 6% of GDP. Interest payments on the national debt reached $970 billion in fiscal year 2025, surpassing defense spending. We're not at Weimar levels, not even close. But ask yourself, are we closer to Germany 1921 at the beginning of the spiral, or closer to 1923 when it's too late to stop? The 7-stage pattern. If you strip away the specific details, every hyperinflation follows the same stages. Germany did it, Venezuela did it, Zimbabwe did it, and the sequence is predictable. Once you're in stage 3, avoiding the rest becomes nearly impossible. Stage 1, the debt trap. It always starts the same way. Government spending exceeds revenue. Debt accumulates. In Germany, war debt of 156 billion marks by 1918. In the United States today, $30 trillion in federal debt. At this stage, no one panics. Debt is normal. Every country has debt. The currency still works fine. Stage 2. The first print. The government faces a choice. Cut spending? Too painful. Raise taxes? Voters would revolt. So they print money. Germany's central bank began buying currency in August 1921. In modern terms, this is quantitative easing, deficit spending funded by central bank purchases. It's framed as temporary, an emergency measure. It never is. Stage 3. Temporary stability. This is the dangerous stage, the one that convinces everyone it's fine. In Germany, the mark stabilized at 320 per dollar in early 1922. People stopped worrying. The government congratulated itself. See? We can manage this. We have it under control. This stage is a trap. Because the underlying problem, spending exceeding revenue, hasn't been fixed. You've just papered over it, literally. Stage 4. Confidence breaks. Something happens. A crisis, a missed payment, a shock. For Germany, it was the French occupation of the Ruhr in January 1923. Suddenly, people realized the government doesn't have control. Confidence in the mark began to dwindle in June 1921. When confidence breaks, the psychology flips. People go from accepting the currency to dumping it. They rush to buy anything real. Velocity increases, prices surge. Stage 5. The acceleration. This is where it becomes visible. By July 1922, prices had risen by 700%. By December, the mark fell to $7,400 per dollar. It's no longer gradual, it's exponential. Every week is worse than the last. The government responds by printing faster, which makes the problem worse, which requires more printing. The feedback loop is now in full control. Stage 6. Social breakdown. Law and order broke down in Germany. Food riots, farmers refusing to sell, pensioners starving, democracy completely undermined. Conspiracy theories spread. Extremist parties gained support. The far right and far left political parties benefited enormously. People desperate for answers turned to anyone promising solutions, no matter how extreme. Doctors even reported a new mental illness called zero stroke, where people obsessively wrote endless rows of zeros or did complex calculations allegedly caused by hyperinflation. Stage 7. Currency death and reset. By November 1923, $1 equaled 4.2 trillion marks. The currency is effectively dead. No one accepts it. The Weimar government introduced the Rentenmark in late 1923, backed by real estate. One Rentenmark equaled 1 trillion old marks. They wiped out the old currency completely, started over. Here's what keeps me up at night. The United States is past stage 1, we're in stage 2, deficit spending funded by the Federal Reserve. Whether we're heading to stage 3 or already leaving it is the question that matters. Because once you reach stage 4, stopping in the sequence requires political will that almost never exists. The psychology of the decision makers. Let's talk about why smart people make catastrophic decisions. Because that's what happened in Germany. These weren't idiots. They were educated economists, experienced politicians, successful businessmen, and they destroyed their own currency. Why? Start with the politicians. Finance Minister Matthias Erzberger implemented tax reforms intended to curb inflation and balance the budget. They were ineffective. The state had to take out further loans from the central bank to plug budget gaps. Think about his position. He's trying to fix the problem. He knows printing money is dangerous, but what are his options? If he cuts spending, riots. If he raises taxes, political suicide. If he defaults on reparations, the French army invades, which they did anyway. This is the trap every finance minister faces. You can see the problem. You understand the math. But the political incentives all point toward kicking the can down the road. Print a little more. Get through this election. Let the next guy deal with it. In Germany, successive governments changed frequently, hampered by parliamentary gridlock. Proposals for tax hikes on capital or property were repeatedly stalled. When the system can't make hard choices, it defaults to the easy choice: more printing. Now the central bankers. The Reichsbank eventually increased its discount rate gradually, reaching 18% by April 1923 and 90% later. Too late. Why didn't they act sooner? Because they were trapped too. If they raised rates aggressively while the economy was weak, they'd cause a depression. If they refused to fund the government would collapse. So they did what seemed reasonable in the moment, gradual tightening, hoping the economy would adjust. It didn't. This is exactly the position the Federal Reserve faces today. The Fed cut rates by 0.25% in October 2025, with inflation still above target and labor markets softening. They're trying to thread the needle, support growth without reigniting inflation. But in the United States, policy rates are expected to remain unchanged in 2025 given upside risks to inflation. They can't raise rates too much because of the debt, can't lower them too much because of inflation. They're trapped in the same box as the Reichsbank. And the public. Here's where it gets really dangerous. From June 1921, Germans began hastily investing money and taking low-interest loans in material assets, which increased the velocity of money. Once people lose faith in the currency, they accelerate the collapse by trying to save themselves. It becomes a bank run, but with an entire currency. The public believes what they want to believe. In 1921 and early 1922, Germans believed the government when they said it was under control. By mid-1922, smart people were borrowing and buying real assets. By 1923, everyone was panicking, but it was too late. The middle class was wiped out, savings gone, pensions worthless. The 2025 connection. Let's connect this to right now, 2025, not with alarm, just with pattern recognition. In fiscal year 2025, the United States ran a deficit of $1.8 trillion, about 6% of GDP. Federal debt held by the public reached 99.8% of GDP. That's approaching World War II levels. And we're not fighting a world war. We're just running normal government operations. Interest payments on the debt totaled $970 billion, surpassing national defense spending. Think about that. We spend more servicing our debt than we spend on the entire military. And net interest is projected to become the largest federal expense by 2051, surpassing even Social Security. That's the debt trap in action. Now let's look at the inflation picture. The 12-month change in PCE prices was 2.1% in April 2025, down from 2.6% at the end of 2024. Core inflation eased to 2.5%, not hyperinflation, not even close. But remember Germany in 1921, prices had doubled during World War I. Annoying, but manageable. The acceleration came later. Here's what matters: that the conditions for acceleration are present. Annual headline inflation in the G20 economies is expected to moderate to 3.6% in 2025 and 3.2% in 2026. But the United States is an exception, with annual inflation expected to rise to just under 4% by the end of 2025 and remain above target in 2026. We're not following the global disinflationary trend. We're diverging from it. Why? Same reason as Germany: fiscal dominance. In emerging markets, a surprise increase in government debt boosts medium-term expected inflation significantly. In advanced economies, it has little effect, except when markets start questioning fiscal sustainability. The United States has been immune to this because of dollar reserve status, but that immunity isn't permanent. The Congressional Budget Office projects that in an alternative scenario where 2017 tax cuts are extended permanently and additional tax cuts are enacted, debt levels could surge to 220% of GDP by 2055. That's not a forecast. That's a warning. If current policies continue, we end up at debt levels no advanced economy has ever sustained without crisis. And here's the kicker. We're in a political environment where neither party will cut spending. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed in 2025 is projected to add $4.1 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. We're accelerating spending while inflation remains above target. That's the same decision Germany made in 1921. Print more, spend more. Hope it works out. Now, are we going to see wheelbarrows full of cash by 2026? Almost certainly not. The mechanisms are different. We have more sophisticated tools, but ask yourself, if we keep running 6% deficits, if interest costs keep rising, if inflation stays above target, what happens? At some point, the market loses confidence. Foreign holders of Treasury bonds start reducing exposure. The dollar's reserve share continues declining, and suddenly we're in stage 4, confidence breaks. The IMF warns that inflation could remain persistently high into 2026 for some countries, although pressures are expected to ease gradually. Expected to ease. That's the assumption, but it's the same assumption German economists made in 1921. What this means for you. You don't control government spending. You don't set Federal Reserve policy. You're not in charge of the deficit. So, what's the point of understanding this pattern? Here's what it gives you: mental clarity in a world that will try to confuse you. When inflation ticks up and officials say it's transitory, you'll know to watch what happens next. Not panic, just watch. Because Weimar Germany taught us that the transition from under control to out of control can happen faster than anyone expects. Understanding the Weimar pattern means you stop treating the dollar as sacred. Every currency is just a promise that a government will maintain its value. And promises can be broken, not saying they will be, saying they can be. That changes how you think about savings, about debt, about what safe means. It means reading news differently. When you see headlines about deficit spending, about the Fed's balance sheet, about inflation data, you'll understand these aren't separate issues. They're all part of the same system, and you'll recognize the stages. You'll know whether we're moving towards stability or away from it. Most importantly, it protects you from normalcy bias. That's the trap that destroyed Germany's middle class. They couldn't believe it would get worse. The market had been stable for decades before World War I. It was unthinkable that it could collapse. So they waited, kept their savings in marks, kept their pensions in marks, and watched it all evaporate. You don't need to become a prepper. You don't need to panic buy gold. You just need to understand that currencies are not permanent. Governments are not infallible. And patterns from history repeat when the same conditions emerge. Being aware of the sequence means you won't be caught completely off guard. If we move from stage 3 to stage 4, you'll see it developing. And you can make decisions based on reality rather than hope. The Weimar hyperinflation isn't a cautionary tale from ancient history. It's a template, a blueprint. And the same sequence that destroyed the mark is visible in the data today. Massive debt, deficit spending funded by the central bank, political gridlock preventing reform, inflation above target, while spending accelerates. We're not in hyperinflation, but we are in the early stages of the same pattern. The archive doesn't predict. The archive doesn't predict the future. It shows you the sequence we're already in. Germany in 1921 looked stable. The currency worked. Shops were open. People were employed. And within 36 months, the currency was dead. Not because of some unforeseeable catastrophe. Because the government made predictable, rational-seeming decisions that led to disaster. We're in the same sequence now. Different mechanisms, different speed. But the underlying pattern is identical. Massive debt, printing money to cover it, hope that it won't spiral, and a political system that can't make hard choices until it's too late. If you want more calm, no-nonsense breakdowns of how debt, empires, and currencies really behave, subscribe to the Debt Archive. Because the patterns don't lie. And the sequence we're in doesn't care whether you understand it or not. It just keeps moving forward stage by stage, decision by decision. The question isn't whether you believe it can happen here. The question is whether you'll recognize the signs when we move to the next stage. Because in 1923, no one saw it coming until it was already over.